Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay.
That is terribly loud.
No,
Waist high? What's the point of the mic at that point? For those who don't know, my name is Wyatt Schrader, and I'm the Executive Director of Catch, a rapid rehousing agency and coordinating entry lead serving Ada County and Canyon County. And so Brady was having a conversation with us after the listening session that many of us were on the call talking about Housing First. So maybe the trepidations around Housing First. What is Housing First? How is it being implemented? Where is it appropriate? And all the questions that came out of that. And so in that conversation, after that call, it was my impression from IHCC and from Brady of, okay, great, let's bring in some folks to talk about this. So that we have two folks here that I'll introduce in a second that are going to lead us in a conversation about some of these questions. But I want to share real quick my personal reflection on coming aboard at Catch, and this is, I think, a story some folks in the room have already heard. But Catch had been using the term Housing First since its inception in 2006, right? When I first came to town, you Google it, Housing First, Boise, those words came up on the website. There's a marketing that happens, I think, at Housing First. But there's actual program model of Housing First, and those two don't always match up. I think that's, unfortunately, the world I know I walked into with Catch. It was good marketing. It made us stand out. Were we truly living it? I don't think so. Add on top of that, we had a little bit of what's called a financial crunch. At the state level, tell me if this sounds familiar, the state changed their mind. States do that? Yes, they do. We had been getting a private investment through TANF to the tune of $400,000 a year. Well, the state changed their mind. They started to pull back, not just us, but a few others. So when I came on, we were set to lose 55% of our funding. So that led, understandably, to an existential crisis. What are we actually about? Who are we actually for? And should we even continue? I've been hearing this term called progressive engagement right around then. Some work I had done in Philadelphia, there was some systems work, a lot of rapid housing providers using this thing, progressive engagement. And if you just did any Googling on progressive engagement, a certain name kept coming up, The Road Home, down in Salt Lake City. And a certain person kept being on all those National Alliance PowerPoints, Melanie. So me and my team went down to Salt Lake and spent 2 days with Melanie when she was working there at The Road Home as our Director of Housing Programs. And we said, what is this thing? And really at the end of the day, it was a huge philosophy shift from the way that we had been working at Catch. We had been giving everyone 6 months because we gave everyone 6 months. We had convinced ourselves that 6 months as well was appropriate because it's what we had been doing. We convinced ourselves Housing First because no one said, no, you're not. But meanwhile, we still were screening out people based on their addictions. We were still screening out people based on their background checks. And no one ever called us on it, so we kept doing it. Though we said on our website that we were Housing First. And at the end of the day, in our existential crisis, whenever we were in this moment of should we even continue, we kind of asked, what population do we really want to serve? Do we want to serve the population as it exists on the street? And I'm sure everyone here has had these conversations. Do we want to serve the population as it exists on the street or as we have been screened out and coming through our doors? And so having these conversations around this idea of Housing First and progressive engagement, one thing that we also realized is by giving everyone 6 months, we're not being as flexible with our cash as we could have been. And for myself as kind of the admin arm of all this, that was incredibly important now if we were about to lose $400,000. Everyone's getting 6 months. So in talking with Melanie and the team down the road home, we realized that there was a philosophical shift that needed, that we weren't being as individualized in our case management as we thought we were. That we were maybe having individual connections through our case management, but our program model was exactly the same regardless of the level of service needed when you walked in the door. Everyone got 6 months, everyone got the same number of engagements. And so this philosophy shift with progressive engagement, I'll let them talk about even a little bit more. For our standpoint, we realized that people actually didn't need 6 months. When we now implemented progressive engagement in the last 2 years. And even though we lost $400,000, we actually served more families, even though we lost almost $500,000, because we became more flexible and then we layered our support. So everyone that comes in our doors now gets a deposit, first month's rent. It's the only thing we guarantee. But we do more intentional reassessment every single month so that we make sure that we're layering support for those who need it, and it allows us to be more self-determinant based on those conversations of case management. So we're truly treating people as individuals, and that pathway for individuality is not just through case management conversations, it's also from my part as administration. Make sure our cash is being as individualized as possible. We're layering our support based on who you are, your level of service need, and how can we help you next month? And the hard question of should we help you next month? We saw the number of months go down, on average, go from 6 months to 4.7. We saw our success rate of number of people that are stably housed and housing a year later change not at all. It stayed at 80%. And what this allows us to do is, even though our organization got significantly smaller, we had less case managers, we had less dollars for rental assistance, we still served the same number of families. Now, I think that's a great administration reason for it, but really what we saw is a huge philosophical shift from our case management as well, of truly being a lot more trauma-informed in our care, and really making this more of a conversation of what you need as a client, as a family experiencing homelessness, versus what we provide you because we decided as an agency. So it's been a long journey, and I won't lie to you, it took a lot of staff turnover to pull off. It took staff turnover to pull off. And that was a lot of guidance we got. There was one agency in Baltimore that reflected on this same thing and said, we didn't see success until we had 100% turnover. I know that's really scary. But we saw it a little bit too. Some of this philosophy shift needed some of that healthy turnover. But now, it allows us to, I think, just be a lot more intentional, and why it's really exciting to have Melody and Julie here. So Julie is also a national expert on coordinated entry and bringing the same philosophies we're talking about, housing first, progressive engagement, and saying, great, what do those philosophies look like on a system level? How can we have community-wide care? So I just want to turn it over. That's my personal perspective on why it's so important for me to have conversations with these two, and for me to constantly be challenged and made uncomfortable by these conversations, and why that uncomfortability hopefully creates a space for us to do some really innovative things. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Julie and Melanie to take from there.
Thank you, Wyatt. That was loud. Is this my box? Am I in my box? Okay. I am so happy to be here today. So thank you for the introduction, Wyatt. And I have to say that wait, let me start. As I worked at the Road Home for many, many years, a lot of the things that we came to practice were purely experimental at first, and progressive engagement, which we're not going to focus too much on in the next hour or so, that was something that was very experimental. We didn't set out to test out the people that we were serving and see how self-determined they were to solve their own crisis in the beginning. But through conversations with people like Wyatt and me saying, this is what we're trying and it's kind of working, and then him trying it and it worked, that is why things like progressive engagement are now best practices nationwide. They're still hard concepts, as are housing first and rapid rehousing. They're hard concepts because they seem a little counterintuitive to service providers. So I want to make that very clear. They weren't things that HUD made up. They weren't these grand ideas that somebody in Congress made up and said, you should do this because it works. They were, all of these concepts that we're going to talk about are things that were tried out on the ground. They worked so well so many times that HUD and the VA and whoever your funders listen to on that federal level said, okay, we have to change what we're doing. So that's why things moved away from programs like COC programs like transitional housing. Everybody thought transitional housing seemed like a good idea. That's why I was saying they gave everyone 6 months for so long. Well, nationwide, we were giving everyone who we were serving who could make it to the point of eligibility 2 years. How many people remember that? Everybody got 2 years. 2 years for everybody. It's like Oprah on the giveaway day. 2 years for everyone. And what the outcomes were way after those programs had been implemented and tried over years and years, were that people were returning to homelessness after 2 years. They were returning to homelessness after 1 year, after 3 years, without the proper support. So the things I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about housing first and rapid rehousing specifically, and then Julie's going to talk about coordinated entry systems. But those are things that I want us all to be very open-minded about and know that they have been tried enough times, and the outcomes are better with those kinds of programs. So who is very familiar with Housing First? I feel it in my bones. I know Housing First is the right thing, the right framework. Okay, yeah. And we're going to ask that throughout this session, and not to say, we just want to be able to gauge where we are. So how Julie actually suggested us going into this, because you're rural providers, and we've both done quite a bit of work in rural areas, the structures are different. They're more spread out. It takes a longer time just to get between buildings and people. And the systems are not so concentrated that you don't have campus models and things like that. We want to make sure that we're gauging how you're feeling about a topic before we start talking about it. So I wanted to ask that, and we'll keep asking. So how we thought we'd go into the presentation is by saying these are the things that we have learned, or these are the things we didn't know before we tried out this particular thing. Oh, you're clicking me. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'll just say Housing First is a framework. It's a philosophy. What it tells us, what it suggests to us as service providers, is that we should make sure there is one sure thing for everybody we're serving, and that is a place. It does not have to be a luxurious place. It needs to be safe, and it needs to pass inspections. It does not have to be luxurious. It can be shared housing. It can be a variety of different settings. Everyone who is in distress that we are encountering needs to have a place where they can be and start working on all of the issues that led them into that stressful time, or that period of chaos in their lives. That's all it is. If we have in our minds as providers and funders, I need to get this person to their place, and then we'll start doing all the supportive services that they need, that seems like a really logical thing for us to be thinking as providers. That's what Housing First is. You overlay it on all of your programs and make sure that that is the one thing. So before Housing First, in Salt Lake City, I worked at the Road Home for a long time, so I worked there before Housing First was even a term used. We thought that everyone needed to be housing ready. Is that a familiar term to people? You had to be housing ready. I remember case managing, and we knew that families had to have an income, they had to be drug-free. We would drug test them, even if we had no suspicion. We would drug test them just in case. They had to be at least 6 months away from a documented incident of domestic violence. Their kids had to have a good track record of attending school. This was just, I'm speaking about families in particular in this situation. And then we had them come before a housing committee, and we would start looking at things that we wanted to make sure that as soon as they got into this house that they were ready for, that they deserved, that they were committed to start working on. So that was things like financial literacy classes, having a savings account, things like really next level things. The first time I heard Housing First, this woman from California came, and it was a big deal for us because people know Lloyd Pendleton. He's pretty famous. He was on the Jon Stewart show. I wish I would have brought the clip to show you guys. But he's he was a big champion for Housing First in Utah, and someone who I listened to all my career. And he brought this woman from California, so all of us were thinking, what is this person from the big city gonna come and tell us? And what she said about Housing First was all the things I just said. You make sure the place is stable. And she said, you make sure that you have something that the family needs, that they want. It is your job to make yourself someone that family wants to connect with. And that is things like making sure they have a toaster when they first move in, like really basic stuff. And just change your whole framework. It is not people deserving housing. It is not them waiting to have enough money for a deposit or to pay off a utility bill before they can go into housing. All of those things you try to really eliminate from the situation. And then it's your job to make yourself accessible. That's Housing First. So instead of having families waiting and getting ready for months and months and months, and their kids growing up in a homeless shelter, we were helping to drop all those barriers, move them into a place as quickly as possible, and then at the time we were offering 2 years, or a permanent subsidy when we had it, for the families who were, harder for us to serve at the time. So, since those years, that has long gone away. We, in the sheltering system in Salt Lake City, our first job is to get someone into a place, and then all the other supportive services come after. Can you click, Julie? Yes. Okay, so I kind of talked about this too. I really just wanted little kind of conversation triggers on my slides. These are not slides you would want to keep and refer back to later, just so you know. I wanted things that would help me remember good points to tell you about the transition from Housing First. So before Housing First, and now I'll skip to the individual side of things. In about 2005, again, we were being encouraged to look at our chronically homeless population. We started hearing about big cities, much bigger than Salt Lake City, that were looking at their data and realizing that people were living in the homeless sheltering system for years and years. And after we had already made the transition to being Housing First, this was kind of the next level. If we could take that population of chronically homeless individuals and help them move into housing, which seemed really counterintuitive, because they were people with addictions and severe mental health issues and really long histories of homelessness, if you could move them into housing and provide intensive wraparound supportive services, landlord services, all of those things, it would alleviate those places that were being utilized in the shelter system, and all of a sudden homeless shelters could become crisis. Places where people go in crises and not places for people to live. So that was kind of the next point on our path, is we looked at our data. We copied just the same way that a big city did. And I've seen plenty of rural areas look at this too, with drop-in center data, or smaller shelters or DV shelters. Look at your data and see who your long-term stayers are. So our data at the Road Home reflected that identically. We had 15% of our population who had been living in the shelter system for 2 or 3 or more years. So we started this little tiny pilot project with a Housing First philosophy already in our minds, and we helped 17 people move out into housing. And these were the longest term stayers and people who had accessed multiple agencies in our community. So our homeless health care, they had the highest number of police arrests or interactions, ER visits. We kind of cross-referenced all of that information and helped them move into housing. It was a circus, I will tell you. It was a circus. But we learned so many things from that first pilot project. And the same person who you may or may not know, Lloyd Pendleton, he just did a TED Talk. He's long retired now, but he did a TED Talk, and it's not out yet, but it should come out soon. He looked at those 17 people to see what their trajectory has been. We helped them move out of housing in 2005. There was not a single one who returned to the sheltering system long term. Some banged up against it a couple times after that, but nobody came back long term. That wasn't because they all of a sudden moved out and were wildly successful and got, middle class incomes. That's not why. It was because of the wraparound intensive case management services and this belief that the place was the stability and housing first was the right philosophy. Okay, next slide. Ooh, I'm talking too long. This is I'm waxing more philosophical, but having kids live in a homeless shelter is bad. Having anybody live in a homeless shelter or on the streets is bad. People give up hope. They start thinking, oh, I applied for that program, wasn't ready for that program. I applied for this other program, they didn't think I met the qualifications. People give up hope, and then they become a person who is totally ingrained in that system, and it's much harder to get out. Next one. Okay, rapid rehousing. So who feels rapid rehousing strong? Like, the program, you know how it works. Okay, so rapid rehousing was kind of the next big change for us, and I'm going to talk about families again. In 2007 and 2008, we saw the worst economic crisis of most of our lives. And at the Road Home, we went from serving about 150 families per year to almost 700 families per year in shelters. We already had made this switch to housing first. We knew that getting people into housing as quickly as possible was best. So we didn't want to build more shelters. Instead, we wanted to move families out as quickly as we could. And we didn't call it rapid rehousing at the time, but we started kind of piloting things. We had some TANF money, we started piloting, moving families out quickly, and then kind of hoping for the best. We didn't know how long we had budgets to keep them in housing. That wasn't something we could predict. We knew that it was our job to try to find more funding to keep some families in housing, but we just didn't know that at the time. So 2 years after the economic crisis, so probably 2010, we started realizing we have been able to serve all of these families, not with 2 years of assistance, with much less assistance, and then try to make really hard decisions about whether or not they were going to become homeless again if we didn't give them another month of assistance or even another month of assistance. And for those really challenging families who had lots of barriers and just weren't succeeding, those were the families we could eventually help move onto permanent subsidies or into permanent housing. We realized that we were able to serve all of those families in some way with a lesser amount of assistance. And guess what the outcomes were? After we measured, we realized that whether a family had 2 years of assistance, or 6 months of assistance, or a tapered subsidy, or any number of different things that we tried, the outcomes were better with rapid rehousing. And I think the most fundamental reason that was the case is that instead of us as providers, I'm foregoing the rest of the slides, by the way. Okay. Instead of us as providers thinking we knew exactly what a family needed while they were in crisis. So we were doing all these fancy assessments, things that we had seen other cities do. We were trying to copy those and trying to quantify the problems that a family had while they were in shelter. That is the biggest crisis of their entire lives, and we were scoring them and saying, this is what you need. We weren't relying on that family's self-determination. because we were the service providers. We knew best. We knew what they needed. We'd spent decades developing fancy programs so we could, know what people needed and serve them with that. But once we switched to a housing first, informed, rapid rehousing program, and we told families, we have this much assistance to give you, we're here, we will wrap ourselves around you with our supportive services, we will make referrals, we're right here if you fail, we're gonna be here when you fail, but this is up to you to make it work. That was the switch. That's when families started succeeding at a much higher rate and not needing as much assistance from us. It's a really hard thing for us to do as a system, but I'll tell you this too, as we got more and more housing resources, more and more money in order to keep these kinds of programs going, this is when the switches started happening, not just because of Salt Lake City at all, but this is when HUD started paying attention to these new kinds of outcomes. And all of the COC programs that are in existence now, all of the VA homeless programs, all want us to be using these types of frameworks or programmatic elements or methods for case management. They want us to be doing that. All of these can adhere to your APR outcomes, to your HMIS data, as long as you want to figure out to squeeze them. You have to kind of reframe everything that you've been doing. So the outcomes are the same rurally and in urban settings. And I hope I offer my undying commitment to, if you have further questions about any of this, I am happy to answer them. Brady and Wyatt both have all of my information and all of Julie's information, and that is all the time I have. So we wanted to leave a lot of time at the end for questions and answers too. So we're taking about 20 minutes each, and then hopefully there will be lots of good conversation. All right, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Your box. Okay, hi everyone. You are very quiet, it's a little intimidating. I'm gonna work on this. I'm gonna ask several questions as we go because I know coordinated entry is probably all too familiar to some of you and maybe on the newer side for some folks. So I just wanna make sure that we're on the same page. But I'm gonna approach this in the same way that Melanie did and just talk about some of the surprises that came out of our work in coordinated entry in a couple of different communities. So I live in Seattle, I grew up in Montana. I've done coordinated entry work in both of those areas, plus some other more urban communities. So what I'm going to talk about today is really pulling from the lessons in Montana, because it's a balanced estate effort where I think there are 8 CAP regions that we have brought together to develop this coordinated system and try to figure out how to meet HUD guidelines, but also coordinate the system in a way that makes a lot of sense for a very huge and rural state. Okay, so who are the coordinated entry lovers in this room? Okay, half of you. Haters. Okay, those who did not raise your hand, where do you fall on the spectrum?
Don't know enough.
Don't know it.
Don't know it.
Okay,
Don't use it.
okay. Where are you from?
I'm from Coeur d'Alene, but we're a governmental agency, so I don't do data.
Okay, fair enough. Anybody else? Just don't use it, don't know it? Okay. All right, so like I said, I'm going to talk about what we've been doing in Montana. It is like a year old. And at this point, if you talk to the people who are working in Montana and leading this effort, they would tell you that they're completely frustrated and burnt out, and be really transparent about it because it's been a really, really tough year in pulling this stuff together. They would also say that they have learned things about their system that they had no idea were happening and not working, and pretty much the opposite of how they wanted their system to look. So I believe that you are the coordinated entry champion in the state.
Would be me. Yeah.
Okay, what's your name?
Dana.
Dana. I'm going to connect you with Teresa in Missoula, Montana, who is in this place with you, where she is the champion and trying to lead things forward and in a pretty frustrated but totally committed place because she sees the benefits and why all of this is worth it. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that she has learned. She and I also talk every day. She's on speed dial, so it's a journey. Okay, so let me start here. When we launched coordinated entry, the term crisis response system was not a thing. Melanie talked a lot about this. People are languishing in shelters. We're not paying attention to how long people are staying. We're just kind of making sure people are okay tonight, but not really having a lot of conversations about permanent housing. And I can speak to that. I worked in the shelter in Missoula 15 years ago. And this will become relevant when I finish my presentation because it has to do with a person who was in that shelter when I started 15 years ago and who has recently been housed through the coordinated entry system. We did 15 years for us to kind of figure it out. So when I was in the shelter for maybe 3 years, I didn't have a single conversation about permanent housing. We were in crisis mode and reacting all the time. It was just like, how do I get you a blanket and a bed and a meal and move on to the next person and get through 200 people? That's what that looked like. Does that sound familiar? Maybe not 200, but a lot, right? Mostly volunteer run, not a crisis response system, a safety and survival program. So that was very eye-opening for our shelter when we launched, especially in Missoula, the largest shelter in the state. That was very eye-opening in terms of really looking at the services that are delivered and the conversations that are had that lead to a very quick connection to permanent housing. That was a very new thing. Okay, here was the most jarring part about it. We thought we knew housing first. This is every community I've worked in. We really thought we knew it until we launched coordinated entry and we literally could not get the folks at the top of our prioritized list housed. They had the highest barriers, the highest vulnerability. We're not eligible for a single thing in any community. Sound familiar? Yeah. The things that come to mind, I guess, even in permanent supportive housing. Is anybody lucky enough to have permanent supportive housing? You do? Okay. So we had, it's new? Awesome. So you're gonna do it right. This is great. We had things like, if you have a misdemeanor charge in the last 5 years, you're not eligible for PSH. That's a total imbalance based on what PSH is intended to do, right? We didn't learn that that level of barrier existed until we had a community-wide list of people experiencing homelessness, also known as a binding list. Sound familiar? That dynamic list of people who are experiencing homelessness so you know exactly in your community or in your state are in need of housing. We tried to house the top 10 off of our list and none of them were eligible for the open units or slots that we had because of project level barriers we had in place. So that's when we started having a lot more housing first conversations. Like our system can't work if we're not implementing housing first on the ground. Melanie talked a lot about this. I guess I used a slightly different term, but you really described assertive engagement, and that is especially within Housing First and Rapid Rehousing programs, permanent supportive housing as well. We're being encouraged to provide voluntary services, right? So we still want to provide them and we want them to look extremely appealing and be very beneficial for folks so they opt in and have a lot of buy-in around those services. And that's something that we've started being trained on is called assertive engagement. We are actively approaching people on a daily basis asking about, what are you doing about your permanent housing goals today? Can I help you pull up Craigslist and see what new postings there are, or whatever it is, right? We're not just sitting back waiting for them to come to our office. We are out there having those conversations and making sure folks know that we care and we want to have those conversations. Same thing with outreach. Within our outreach system, we weren't focused on permanent housing. It was very similar to shelter. Here's a sandwich, here's some socks. Do you feel like you're safe enough tonight? Okay, I'll see you in a couple of days or a couple of weeks. We really had to transition what our outreach looked like and coordinate that and make sure folks were hitting the hot spots and the gaps, but also having those permanent housing conversations every single time, trying to connect people even when there weren't subsidized housing resources available. That was a huge, huge swap and part of the housing first system that we really had to develop. So this one is particularly challenging for the people who are leading this effort because you kind of become the bad guy in the community. Coordinated entry really highlights the things that aren't working well. And they're usually things that you didn't know were happening. You don't have system level data in the past that you can go off of, except for the PIT, who believes in the point in time count being super reliable data. Yeah, a lot of strong no's. But it's the best we have, so it's what we've used historically. Coordinated entry provides this awesome system level data that we can rely on and start making data-driven decisions, and it also points to some things that are really, really not going well, right? And whoever is leading that effort has to start to talk about those things and becomes kind of a jerk. Even if you do it in the most gentle way, you're having to highlight things that aren't yours to own, but have to be fixed in order for coordinated entry to work well and your system to work well. So it's really, that was really hard and surprising for the folks that have been owners over the systems that I've worked in. Okay, so let's see. This point I think is particularly important for rural communities and something that has looked a lot different in work in Seattle that I've done compared to Montana, and that is we have a lot of foundations in Seattle. We have a ton of staff working on these things all the time. It is still a hot mess. There's nothing figured out about it, really. We have a lot of work to do when we have paid staff. And when we look to Montana and the balance of state, there are people who have just stepped up as champions who really, really believe in this concept and organizing a system that works well for the most vulnerable folks. And they're typically not funded to do this work and have like 8 other major things on their plate that they have to do at any given time. So this was really, really eye-opening. We had to adjust, in Montana, a lot of what people were prioritizing and focused on, and get really, really creative about who could step into roles that we didn't know that we needed, like navigation. Anybody know what navigation is? What is it? Someone brave. I'm waiting and it's gonna be awkward. Yep.
Helping families or individuals locate and utilize resources that would be beneficial for them.
Yes, that's it. So within a coordinated entry system, thank you, you've got your binding list of folks and you have prioritized them usually based on vulnerability, right? So you have your top, let's say 15 most vulnerable people in the state of Idaho, and you're trying to figure out how to get them housed. They are probably 15 people who have not had case managers or access to supportive services in the past, or have chosen not to access those services, right? And we're trying to get them housed first in whatever housing openings that we have available. We've got to figure out who in our community can provide the navigation services, essentially on a volunteer basis, and step up and say, hey, I will help that person get their ID this week, and I will come back next week to what we call case conferencing and let you know that this person has what they need to move into housing quickly, and we can move forward, and I will make sure they actually get to the intake appointment. I will take them to that property, whatever it is. That is not something that is typically funded, especially in a balance of state type of situation. So it's about people getting really creative and saying, all right, let me look at what my day looks like and what tasks I'm prioritizing, and is there anything that I can let go that's not quite as important as getting the #1 person on this list housed? Can I step up and volunteer for this navigation role to actually get them there? And historically, that's been a huge gap in actually getting the most vulnerable people to housing. So it's required us all to sit back and take a look at what we're doing on a daily basis and really reprioritize what we're doing and make sure that all of it is connected to getting people permanently housed. All right, there's also this really awkward situation when you're all sitting around a table like this, and it's who knows what case conferencing is? Yes, a few people. Will you tell us what it is?
As a whole group of people who might be working together around a particular client and just discussing barriers and resources that might be available to them.
Yeah, awesome. You're barrier busting for the folks who are at the top of that list and need to get into your permanent housing resources, right? And so sometimes you'll be sitting around this table in a very public setting and you'll realize that the person sitting next to you has a ton of barriers to get into their program, and no one on that top of your list of folks who are needed help is going to be eligible to get in there, and you have to call them out in that public setting. And as a system, figure out how you're gonna start to reduce your barriers. And that's a really, really, really hard thing. And what we found is that the people who were really good at motivational interviewing with clients were the best at calling people out because they could do it in ways that they didn't actually realize what was happening. It became like their idea to start to reduce those barriers and not something they were told to do. So we strategically placed people in those case conferencing settings who had those skills with the instructions essentially. When you hear of something that is probably not the right thing to be doing, it's your job to figure out how to call that out. So that was a really important thing and gave us there was new value to training people in motivational interviewing beyond just direct service with folks experiencing homelessness. And that was really unexpected. Okay, here's the final one, and the one that annoys me the most probably, but I think is the most important. Having to repeat the why of why you're doing this, why you're creating this, what feels like a very complex homeless system that's easier for folks to access and to have this standardized assessment completed and be prioritized in this systematic way, and then referred to your community's housing openings. It's really, you kind of get caught up in the day-to-day frequently and sit back and say, why are we doing all of this new work? This is in addition to my already tutored job. One of the most frustrating things that I have found is that we have to constantly repeat the why of coordinated entry, almost on a daily basis in these meetings. And it's like this, we wouldn't be doing this if we had enough resources for everyone in need. We're doing this because we have a severe shortage. We have way more people who need it than we have resources. And we have to be really smart about how we place people, prioritize and refer people into our limited housing resources, knowing, like Melanie said, that a lot of people will be able to figure out their housing crisis on their own, and we have to reserve our precious, limited, subsidized housing resources for people who absolutely don't have any other safe alternatives. And that, to me, is the thing that makes all of this effort worth it, but I think it's really easy to lose sight of that. So, one thing that happened in Missoula that is a very helpful reminder that I'm coming back to from the beginning, when I worked in the shelter, I had to kick out anyone who was intoxicated, anyone who smelled like booze. I had to kick them out. I was the only staff person. It was a totally unsafe job, but it's fine. I got through it. There was this guy who every single night he would come to dinner. He was intoxicated. It was well known. He was just chronic. There was a chronic alcohol addiction. And so we'd give him a sack lunch, and he had to leave the shelter. Literally 15 years later, a group of us came together, developed the coordinated entry system, built that list of people by name who was experiencing homelessness. Then you prioritize it based on vulnerability, which means the most likely to die on the streets, right? That's what vulnerability means. He was number one on that list and the first person that got into the next housing resource. And that, my gosh, I mean, there's a lot of guilt associated with it taking 15 years to actually make that happen, but that for me landed the importance of coordinated entry in a community. So that's what I've got for slides. I think we want to just really open this up for conversation and discussion and hard questions, right? Okay, cool.
You had some thoughts on the widespread homelessness on the streets?
Why it's increasing? Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, especially on the West Coast and Rocky Mountain area. I think obviously our housing prices are insane and our wages haven't changed for the most part. So there's a bigger gap than ever. We're doing a much better job of counting and understanding how many folks are experiencing homelessness, so we have better data. But I think we have better data and the problem is definitely growing. I also think as communities develop these systems, people hear that there's actually help available and we are engaging in a different way. And yes, help is available in a different way and not nearly enough help. So we have more folks asking who need it, who historically maybe didn't have hope around there being any sort of help available. I think there are a lot more things. I think I've said the word Amazon like 20 times this morning and talking about my own community. but we have a real gap between housing available, even having units, we have a less than 1% vacancy rate. I would guess Coeur d'Alene is similar in some seasons, if not all.
Very low policy.
And for those others who have a 3 to 4% vacancy rate, you probably have a different issue, which is substandard housing that where you can't pass an inspection, right? So there are different issues, but there are so few units actually available. They're affordable to people and appropriate to even live in. Yeah. So I think those are the high level things. Yeah.
I'll just say, in housing, we house the 18 to 22-year-old, the young adult population. So rapid rehousing and housing first makes sense to us because we've always tried to remove barriers. These are kids that have lots of barriers and can't get a place on their own because of resources. So it makes sense to me in all those ways. I think the hardest part is just having enough, because we do like free jobs, having enough staff and case management and support to put around there to do it well.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, no, we don't have any kind of, anything good to say about just the lack of money to pay for more staff. But I'll say, so I'm working on youth programs on the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project nationwide, so I work with a few communities, but one that is more rural than any of you, I would venture to guess, is the Ohio Balance of State Southeastern region, which is one of the low corners of Appalachia. So in their point in time count that they did for youth, they didn't do voices of youth. I heard some, you guys did voices of youth, or youth count?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So they didn't do that. They weren't even like on the radar for that, but they did a point in time count. There were 6 young people. So why I want to talk about that is because the challenges are all the same. They are all the same, depending on where you are, if you're in a rural setting or an urban setting. If you have a caseload of 6 young people, actually their counts are much higher. They just couldn't access the young people because a lot of young people are doubled up and, you know, hopping around or even camping in the woods in that area. But the challenges are the same, so really pay attention to what is happening in every community. And if you find a little nugget of something that sounds interesting that you think you could apply to your own community, bring it back and explore it. But the youth projects, and I'm interested because on a lot of these boards, you're talking about the younger population, and I'm just interested to see what you guys do with that, since you're identifying that as kind of a priority to talk about. That's all.
I thought it was interesting because you can't be emancipated before 18, and so
Before
it's
8.
yes. So it's interesting in that way where all of our surrounding states, you know, would be a little bit
Or
different, but
16.
it's 18.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Why? So, do you know why that is? Is that just kind of an antique? It's an antique law, something you might be
I
able to
think it's
revisit.
just old legislation.
Yeah. Mhm.
And it's good in some ways because it makes our state accountable to provide services and funding to youth until they're 18.
Yeah.
But it also creates some barriers for those youth that have had to raise themselves and then they're in
Yeah.
care and have to be part of a system. And that's our
Yeah.
funding.
That's interesting.
But it's how we get our funding that way.
I'm guessing that you're already on top of this, but one thing that we've seen, especially with youth, is really making sure that direct service staff are trained in family reunification. And for non-youth populations, single adults and families, diversion. Very similar concepts and very intentionally exploring any safe alternatives that are available. And in Montana, that has been a total game changer for us because there's such a massive lack of PSH, first of all, permanent support housing, but also very little rental assistance available. So we spend more of our time trying to divert folks and provide family reunification services to young people than we ever thought we would. And that's built into the front doors of the coordinated entry system in every community. So there's some really good trainers out there. Cleveland Mediation Center is one of the best. they're actually still affordable. They don't realize how good they are yet. Cleveland Mediation Center. Ed Boyd is the guy who's really good at diversion, who's associated with them. Boyte.
So we have quite a bit more time. Yeah.
Well, not a question, but
Mike?
a comment that I've heard is, with this Housing First, we're sitting around waiting for people to come to us. And that is causing worse outcomes because there's no pushing. So can you talk about like the assertive engagement a little bit more, what that looks like in this?
Yeah, so I met with Jeremy Blades, is that his last name? Okay. I met with Jeremy from Catch earlier today, and we were talking about Housing First and how it changes what case managers do. And I think case management is that's a common position. Outreach workers are pretty common positions. You might not have a lot of them, but a lot of communities have outreach workers. What Housing First what this whole idea does is makes it so your case managers, so what I told Jeremy, we were talking kind of about something else, is case managers don't need a desk. They do not need a desk. Case managers become more like outreach workers. Clinicians who are on your team, therapists, become more like case managers. It's kind of all in. Everyone's in to do whatever it takes. When you have a coordinated entry system, or even if you don't have a system, but you have a good list and you know who's homeless in your community, it is the job of everyone. A navigator would be ideal, but if you don't have money for a navigator and you don't have dedicated outreach resources, it's the job of everyone to be going out and finding that person and bringing them in. Sometimes that takes a lot of times. Sometimes the person tells you where to go a number of times before they will engage, and you can kind of imagine why. It's not that the population that you're gonna serve, especially if they're near the top of your list of people who are vulnerable, it's not like they've had an easy go of things. It's not like systems have worked for them. It's probably not like social workers have worked for them. So in order to engage and actually get people to a place where you're helping them get into a place and then heal, it's the job of the providers to go out and get them. And then in this Housing First framework, it's the job of everyone to keep them there. So that's a flip too. And I don't think I'm quite answering your question, but it kind of makes it so this whole idea of homeless services is not done over a desk. There's not a case plan with boxes to check. Of course, you have to do case notes, you have to have outcomes met, you have to enter information into HMIS in order to continue getting at least COC funding, which a lot of us get. But it makes it so the whole engagement to a person is more natural, it's real, it's more realer. For some reason that didn't sound right coming out.
I think you used a really good example with Jeremy, and it was about like you approach them with basic needs and asking about food tonight, and you kind of took him through a progression. Will you talk about that example?
Is this the dating thing? No, not that.
No.
Like,
You have someone who's resistant to engaging. I think I just messed that up. Stop that. Okay. So you have someone who is more resistant to engaging with you, doesn't really want to communicate with you as a case manager, and you said, all right, so we're going to stop by and just say, are you okay tonight? Like, are you hungry? Can I get you a McDonald's gift card? Can I take you to McDonald's? Whatever, meet basic needs and establish that basic level of a relationship and trust. And like, they kind of see that you care, which might be the first time they've ever seen something like that before from a professional, unfortunately. And then, so you do that and you go away. It's not like, okay, now meet with me for a case management meeting next week at this time, like we've kind of done traditionally. It's, okay, I'm gonna show up tomorrow and say, the food bank's open during these hours. Can I take you there? Can we go load up? Just stock your shelves and make it a super organic thing and not force a conversation they're not ready to have. So what would you do next?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then they say, yes, I'll go to the food bank with you, and then you go to get them and they're not there. So then you leave a note and you say, hey, I stopped by to get you so we could go to the food bank. It all becomes the job of the case manager or the outreach worker or the navigator. And this applies to either someone who's living on the street or someone who's already living in a house, if you've already placed them. The phrase, the saying of I don't want to work harder than the person I'm serving is wrong. That is why we are in this business, is to work hard and serve people who have not been served well by the system. That's why. I don't mean to sound harsh, but that is one thing I feel really strongly about. So it's the job of the social worker or whoever is working to make it, to make sure that relationship is built. And then at some point, and I've seen this happen so many times, at some point, the person, the case manager becomes the participant's person. That is the person when there's something that goes wrong, they come to the case manager. Even if it's something bad, even if it's, wow, I had 3 people stay at my house for a week, the landlord's really mad, what am I gonna do? The case manager starts being the problem solver alongside the participant instead of somebody who's seen in the power position. So I will say the dating thing.
I don't remember.
So I felt like this was genius. And I thought of it right on the spot, which I was really excited about. So I said to Jeremy Blades, I said, it's like when you're dating, and I qualified and said I've not dated in 25 years, so I think it's like when you're dating, but you're chasing. You are chasing all of these people you want to date, and they're like, ugh, this is too much, it's too much pressure, I'm gonna stay in my house, like, it's too much, right? So instead of continuing that,
I think your own stuff's coming up.
Okay. Instead of continuing that, a really smart thing to do is to change your approach and make yourself something that all of those people are attracted to, right? So you change yourself. So this is what the case manager does. The case manager needs to change so the person that they're serving, or the caseload of people that they're serving, wants to come to them. They want to come to them because they have a car that can take them to a medical appointment. They have a connection at the food bank that can get them in when they need to get in a certain hour. They can get them to the VA if they're a veteran. All of those things, the person who was the chaser in this dating scenario became the person that everyone is attracted to and wants to go be connected to. So I loved it in the moment. I'm not being as inappropriate as I was in the moment.
I like it.
In this setting, but I think that's what you're doing. You're just kind of flipping the script and making sure that your lens is that you are serving other people. That is the job of homeless service providers and of homeless services systems. Do not screen out. Do not block people from different things. I'll say this too, I think this is important. In Housing First, people often think that there are no requirements, there are no consequences, you're enabling all of the people that you're serving because you're giving them a house, even if they are addicted or have barriers. That's another thing to flip. There are consequences. There are lots of consequences for people, and they're natural consequences. So I think it's the role of a person in a supportive services position to point out the natural consequences that are happening. Hey Joe, you had 5 people staying at your house last week. That's a really common thing that happens among people in housing. We hear that all the time. Or you had a loud party, or you didn't pay your rent. Hey Joe, this thing happened in your apartment, your landlord's mad. This is the consequence. And as a service provider, it's our job to try to soften those blows person staying in their house, but sometimes there are deal breakers. If a person is required to pay rent and they are not paying, and you don't have a backup cushion, you don't have another agency you can call upon or a church that will swoop in and help pay that participant's portion of the rent, sometimes the natural consequence is that they get an eviction notice. And then what are you gonna do? But it's the job of the supportive services provider and system to try as much as you can to help the person maintain the housing at any cost. But there are consequences, and you're not enabling.
I just heard you kind of say two things. I wrote it down. You had said, it's up to you to make it work earlier. So that is giving that person or household the power to make their own choices. Then just now I'm hearing, but we're going to do all of these very many steps to help
To engage you.
you, to assist you in all of those
Okay,
things.
yeah.
Because to me, that's almost beyond, I mean, they're two different things. If somebody doesn't make an appointment, the consequences, it's up to you to do it, should be there, or up to you to decide what services you want beyond that, the dating thing.
Yeah.
But, and the other thing I was hearing is, for one person, you're taking up or one household, how much time
Yeah.
doing all of those various steps, and we have 40 in the shelter. We don't have 40 people to help 40 people.
Well, yeah, and caseloads can vary. I hear how you're
So I'm wondering which way you're going.
I hear how you're hearing two different things.
Yeah.
Let me pull them together
Okay.
and say the job of the supportive services provider and the system is to have all of the resources a person could need and may need to access. You're not imposing those things upon the person. You have them, so that's what brings the person to you or the household. They come to you because you know how to do things. You know how to navigate systems and apply for food stamps and go to the food bank. You know how to do all of those things, but you're not taking away their self-determination. You're not saying, the self-determination idea is more in a rapid rehousing setting. So we're kind of talking about engagement over here and rapid rehousing and helping people be successful on their own. You never want to do things, it's like, do you know the idea of love and logic for kids?
Yeah.
Okay, we won't get into that because that's a whole, I'd have to explain more. It's like with a child,
Yeah.
and I'm not diminishing people that we're serving, but it's like with a child. You are the parent, you have all of these things that you know how to do, but you don't want to say every time to the child, get your coat, get your pants, put your shoes on the right way, hey, your hair looks weird. You want them to start doing things on their own, right? And if they need to come to you because you know how to do things, you're there for them. And if they fail, if they go to, okay, this is not love and logic, but this is an example. If they go to school and it's a super blizzardy day and they call you at lunchtime and say, Mom, can you bring me my coat? I forgot to bring it. They failed. Do you take the coat to them? Probably. You're the mom. If you're the case manager, probably. You're the case manager. You're picking them up when they fail. So does that kind of, we're talking about engagement, how to make sure a participant, a client, wants to stay connected to you. How to make sure that you're case managing without imposing all of these things that you want somebody to do.
It almost sounds though that you're engaging them to be dependent on you.
Yeah, that's.
And once I find out you're willing to do all of those things for me, where do I step up and say, I want to do it myself? As a client at the shelter.
So I think
We don't let our staff drag them around because that one person has to stay at the shelter. years. So how do we get them to want to do it without that dependency? Because a lot of people want that uninterrupted attention.
Yeah.
One person can take up hours and hours and hours.
Yeah.
So we have 39 others that are waiting. So,
Do you have something?
Yeah, I have something that I think there's a differentiation between services in shelter and services in permanent housing, or even transitional housing, if some of you have that. In shelter, the intention is in a highly functional system, there is urgency to get someone out of shelter and into permanent housing, and you are hyper-focused on only that. So if you need food to get through today, we're gonna help meet basic needs, and we're gonna bring up the permanent housing piece with urgency, and that becomes a culture. Everyone in the shelter is talking about permanent housing, residents, staff, volunteers. People start to see folks leaving quickly, it just becomes a total shift. And once someone is in housing, then it's that longer term engagement, whether it's rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, then it's like we can offer more and build this relationship with this long-term goal of helping you stay here and connect with mental health resources if that's what you need, or addiction services if that's what you want, I should say. Yes. So I think that's the difference, that we've had to make that shift in Montana. In the shelter, we are focused on very basic survival and getting out of here into a safe, permanent place.
and
So
I
that's the
have been
difference for
doing
me.
those.
Yeah,
those
but it's
concepts.
hard because right now, people are staying in shelter for probably a long time because you don't have enough permanent housing resources and you haven't maybe made this shift yet. So there's a balance there. You are often offering more in shelter while you're making that transition. But once you're there, it looks pretty different than it used to. If you're not doing life skills classes in shelter anymore, we used to do that. But that doesn't make sense after you've made this crisis response shift and get folks into permanent housing quickly.
So,
And then-
so related to the discussion, so I'm with a nonprofit in Eastern Idaho. We have permanent supportive housing, congregate living in different houses. So one of the challenges I have with our case managers is, I think this I think relates to what we're talking about, is instead of using power and position with clients to use influence, rapport building, consider what's driving, if there's problematic behavior, where's the dysregulation coming from. It's so easy, and I've got I've got a young social worker who just got her bachelor's degree in social work, and interestingly, she comes from a different country, and she's very much into these judgments, and so that's also part of the training that is a challenge for us, is to suspend these judgments, meet people where they are, don't play the power and influence card, because we do have a great deal of power because we're controlling somebody's housing.
I really like the way that you framed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was really hopeful for that social work student example too. Good luck, I hope that works out.
It's been hard.
Yeah, I bet.
It's hard. It's so hard not to judge. It's hard for any of us not to judge and not to, think we know why somebody is the way they are. But I think building that rapport and having a good relationship with people that we're serving within some boundaries, you don't want to have too good of a relationship. You do. Okay,
Back to the dating.
Yeah, I was wondering where she's going with that
It's been
date.
25 years. Maybe
Date's
that's
going
all
on.
right. I'll think of a new scenario to talk about. But it's just really hard to serve purely, I think. But when we're doing that and we know that the best thing for everyone is to have a place that they are safe and secure, that's where they heal. Like I've said that a couple times, that's where do you heal? Think of, sometimes I used to get strep throat. I've had it a few times, and I've never been sicker in my whole life. Just fevers and chills, and it's pretty easy to get strep throat. But I often, when I was working at the road home, I would think, what if I was on the streets and had this? I would rather die. I felt that bad. And people have have much more severe ailments. But it's similar, like how do you heal when you're not like in your bed, and people who have had these really big lives with lots of bad things that have happened to them, how are they gonna heal if they're not in a place? They have to have a place. So if that is our pure service, is to make sure the place is intact, and then work through all of these other things that come up all the time, then I think we're doing a good job if we can get to that place. But it's so hard not to judge. It's our nature. Yeah.
I have a question about coordinated entry and domestic violence service providers. And in your experience in Montana, how, we kind of run into a conflict with confidentiality, and how do you coordinate to make sure that everyone's working with other service providers when we can't share the names of clients or referrals?
Yeah.
What does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, so Montana has a pretty bad HMIS system to begin with, so most stuff is manual right now while we figure out what we're gonna do as far as a new vendor. Do you have a decent HMIS right now? The vendor's probably in the room and I'm being really inappropriate or something.
No, it's
Okay,
great.
you're using HMIS. Do you have a DV system separately?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So you're farther ahead in that way. What we do, we rely on the case conferencing setting on a weekly basis to bring all of it together. So right now, the DV shelter provider is hanging on to that list, so only they know the names and contact information, personally identifying information of folks who have identified as DV survivors. And we use a unique identifier on the one by name list that the community lists, or that the community holds. So when they come together at the case conferencing table, everyone's included on that list, but names are not included. But shelter providers know who they are and have a separate process to make sure they have navigation and know when they're coming up on the list for a referral. So it's all about that coming together at the case conferencing table to make sure that you know kind of the order of things and who's going to get a referral next. But then going back as DV providers and kind of having a separate system to make sure you're doing what you need to do in a confidential way and honoring their privacy. I can connect you to the Y in Missoula if you want to talk about how that looks behind the scenes at the actual shelter, but I know that they're relying on case conferencing a lot. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So the case conferencing, are you doing it like each city has their own? Because Montana's spread like we are, like.
Yeah.
So as a community, we would be having a case conferencing weekly? And
Yes.
who would all be at the table?
Right now, we're doing it by CAP region and the urban center of each region, which is Havre in one area and Missoula in another. It's a different size of place. But yeah, the service providers come together because they're all based in those more urban areas. They come together weekly. There's a huge push to end veteran homelessness in Montana, so they're doing veteran case conferencing separately, and then everybody else each weekly. They have, in communities where the numbers are a little higher and they can't get through the lists every week, they've talked about doing a family case conferencing meeting with family providers and outreach, single adults, and vets. So it depends on your numbers and the capacity, but yes, it is weekly. Try to keep it under an hour so that people can commit to that and keep coming. And we've just tried to make sure that we have a really good facilitator who can make sure we get through the list as much as possible every time, and make sure that the folks at the top of that priority list are ready to go as soon as something comes open.
So all providers come to that meeting?
Some providers.
Oh,
Anyone who knows people on the prioritized list has to be at that table in order for it to work. Housing providers can come, especially housing providers who tend to say no or have higher barriers. You want them at that table, so they'll start to gradually change their mind about those barriers and reduce them, and have a little community pressure to do so. So that's been a critical piece for us. We did start with all of the providers and all of the outreach and navigation type folks. And now it's kind of tapered back because, for example, the Salvation Army has rapid rehousing and they will take anyone. They don't need to be at the table to have that conversation. They just need to receive the referral when they have an opening. So they've said, we're not going to spend an hour at this meeting. We're going to take referrals and house people during this time instead. So it's been a gradual thing. Our case conferencing started out big because people needed to know what that transition was like and have an understanding and transparency. And people have opted out over time when they realize who needs to be here and who can be doing other things during this time. However, people are on call essentially during that hour every week. So if we need to text them and get an immediate answer in order to move forward on the list, we can get that. So that's kind of the community agreement. You don't have to be here, but you have to be watching your phone. Yeah.
Julie, you both were talking about how a lot of these models, while the face of homelessness doesn't actually differ as much as we think between urban and rural. Can you take that same thought? I'm curious then from like maybe a Montana standpoint, from balance of state, from the implementation of coordinated entry, like how much does actually vary in each of those cap regions?
The actual structure.
The actual structure of
Yeah.
the response system.
That's a good question, and we learned from Ohio, balance of state. They felt like they would have done, and Minnesota actually. So essentially, I'll try to be really short with this. Minnesota and Ohio started out saying, hey, every region in our state, figure out what will work best for you and do it, and then we'll come together and figure out where the overlap is. And then they took a step back and were like, we should have some common standards at least, so there's some consistency, like with an assessment tool. So they kind of helped us to outline what the consistencies should be, but still provided enough flexibility for regions to localize it. So we essentially in Montana figured out 5 things. If I can remember them on the top of my head, it'll be a miracle. But we found 5 things that the COC board ended up adopting as every region, every CAP region will have these 5 things in place and then localize it to make it work. So we used a standardized binding list template, which is the US ICH, the Interagency Council tool, to collect data and track the binding list. That is the template everyone uses, so we have consistent data across the state. That's critical because when someone moves from Butte to Helena, we want to have the same information and not have to have them do anything again just because they moved CAP regions.
What's that called again?
The binding list template is the US ICH tool, United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Also important because if you ever feel like you are reaching an end, like for example the veterans homelessness, and want to demonstrate that and get federal recognition, they will ask for that tool. That's the tool that has all the data they're going to need. So if that's important here, it is important in Montana. They want to end veteran homelessness and become competitive for more federal funding, so they're using that tool. So, common by name list template, whether it's the US ICH one or not, we decided that we were going to implement diversion at the front door of every single region because communities that have implemented it well can divert up to 50% of households who come into the shelter saying, I need a place to stay tonight. So we all agreed that this is a priority and we're going to invest resources in training folks on diversion so that we have as few people entering our system as possible. So by name list template, diversion, common assessment tool. In Montana, they're starting with the VI SPDAT, vulnerability index. Yeah. In Montana, I think we've done 6 coordinated entry workshops and let communities make these determinations before we set the standards, and 4 communities chose the VI SPDAT on their own. And then we said, okay, as a state, we need to go in that direction. So it's not like it was a top-down sort of thing. We let communities choose first. There was a balance anyway. Okay, what I said, binding list template, diversion, common assessment tool, common outcome measurements. So we have 6 goals, and I'm happy to share them with you, that we are tracking in every community to know if coordinated entry is actually working, but every community sets their own target. So, for example, what's the average length of time between a person gets an assessment and gets into permanent housing? And we're tracking that, but every community's goal looks different because in Missoula, it's way harder to house people than in Great Falls, given their housing market and numbers of folks. So it doesn't make sense to have a common target, but we need to track the same data. Prioritization policy. Who's most appropriate for PSH versus rapid rehousing versus diversion? And we're using the VI SPDAT matrix recommendations for that. I think those are the 5. So I'm happy to share any of that. If you want any tools for coordinated entry, Montana's happy to share, and they stole them from other places too. So it's just a lot of sharing.
So we've had some discussion about the VI SPDAT. Have you heard that? That was the little interplay you saw, sort of the stickers here. So we've had some very spirited debate around the state concerning that instrument. I'll just be upfront. I'm hugely troubled by the VI SPDAT. People here know why. So from a trauma-informed standpoint, did Montana consider that?
Yes, it was a big debate. Okay. Yeah, and nobody feels great about it either. But it's just kind of like, this is the most common tool right now. We're going to test it, and in a year we're going to reassess. We looked at at other tools and it just felt like the training is free, we can't afford to do anything else. We don't have the time to do our own assessment, so let's just test this and see how it works, so.
Do you like what's the tool out of Seattle, what's that called?
The VAT,
The bad.
You guys like that?
the
I do.
VAT,
Yeah.
vulnerability assessment tool, is
I
that
do
right?
like that. I feel like I do like it. I think
Okay.
it's more of a it's a socially focused index rather than a medically vulnerable index, and I do like it. When you're done, though, I'll talk a little bit about dynamic prioritization.
Oh, perfect. One quick thing,
Okay.
this is a secret, and the camera's on. But in Seattle, we're using the VI SPDAT, and the single adult world in particular is quite troubled by it because we have such a limited amount of PSH compared to the single adults who are chronically homeless even. And so what's kind of in talks right now is let's use the VI SPDAT to get that vulnerability score, and then do the VAT with folks who score high enough to truly prioritize our PSH for the folks who are the sickest, which the VAT gets to more. So we might pair it. I don't think that's the ideal situation, but they have to stick with the VI as a starting point, and that's kind of the compromise.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't tell.
So one thing, it's a coordinated entry systems component. Prioritization is really important, and we've all been encouraged to create these prioritized by name lists for a long time. The VI SPDAT came out before, it kind of came out in the biggest way. So I think that's what most HMIS systems are populated with. That's what most people are trained on for free, and people are pretty comfortable using it for kind of administrative reasons. But I'm not speaking for HUD. I'm just speaking from my own experience. There are other tools you can use. People across the country, communities across the country have taken tools and kind of Frankensteined them together for what suits their own community or their geography, and that's okay. HUD, the requirement in community entry guidance from HUD and USICH and the VA now is that you use a common assessment tool. So I want to say that. The next part of it, though, is that is not the only data you bring in to prioritize people. If it is, you should take a look at it again, because that is one point. You are meeting a person, depending on the tool you're using, you might be getting self-report data without any actual data, historical HMIS data or other systems information being brought into that equation. And that is also okay to bring in those other points of data. So in Salt Lake City, we changed up what we were doing. We were required by our state to use the VI SPDAT, so that's what we did. That's what we still do for people who we think are chronically homeless. So that's an important delineation. We don't give the assessment to every single person. If there are other indicators or places that they enter the system that suggest they might be chronically homeless, then we administer that assessment. But then we're also bringing in length of time homeless. So we pull straight from our HMIS system, like system-wide. Current condition, and this is where in the case conferencing idea or the provider input, it becomes questionable because some people think that when you're getting provider input, it's just the squeakiest wheel case manager that gets their person into housing the fastest. So you have to be really careful in how you manage that. And then there are other elements as well. So in Salt Lake City, we bring in all of those pieces of information, and it affects the way the prioritization is. So nationally, that is something that communities who are doing prioritization in this clean cut kind of VI SPDAT K, you have a 15, you go there, you have 12, you go there. In that way, what they're finding is that using those scores alone is just creating these huge wait lists. Because all of a sudden, you have this group of people who score high on the VI SPDAT, so they all are supposed to go to PSH, and there's just not enough PSH. So there's this idea of dynamic prioritization, where you still are comparing people with each other in a community one another and still creating a prioritization. But if there's not a resource for that person for which they are most suitable for, you go to the next resource. You also go to what that person chooses. Maybe they don't want this PSH opportunity, but there's a perfectly good rapid rehousing place that they're eligible for. So the idea is to pull in all of the data, still have a concept of who is more vulnerable in your community, and know that those resources that are already created for very vulnerable populations are utilized for people who really need that kind of resource. So it kind of mixes up how we're thinking about by name lists and coordinated entry system prioritization overall. But I think it's making it so it is not only a one-point data decision. It is that, the VI-SPDAT score, or whatever assessment tool score, gets them onto the list, and then you can mix them up even more based on other information. Also, people change, so one thing that I'm really happy about with the idea of dynamic prioritization is that people change. So if they got entered onto a by name list 6 months ago even, think of a time that you've had a lot of change, and especially if you're living on the streets or something, a period of time that you've changed a lot in 6 months. You may have answered the questions on whatever tool very differently than as you would now. So it allows for that kind of changing. It makes the management of a by name list even more complex, and the manager of that list needs to be pretty sophisticated. And also, it is very important to have all of this be extremely transparent. So decisions that are made, if somebody who is number 15 on a prioritization list is moved into a place before all of 1 through 14, for instance, which should not be talking about numbers at all, but if that happens, there needs to be a transparent reason that that decision was come to. So that, I mean, we have whole days-long trainings about that, about prioritizations and coordinated entry, and we're not even going to get into it in a way that makes it clear enough at all, like not a chance here, but people are thinking about it, and I get why there are eye rolling and giggles, and I get it.
Can I ask a different question? In what has been effective in some of the communities that you've worked in? So I'm in Eastern Idaho, and other providers within that community who are all fine, stellar people, they have, I would say, a level of ownership and control. Speaking of, we were talking about case management earlier. So some other agencies want to control their destiny insofar as who they're going to serve. It's been apparent since we've started having the coordinated entry conversation in Eastern Idaho. And I have high regard for these people, and we haven't yet implemented coordinated entry. We're scheduled to launch in January. But I've known since we've begun this conversation that there are some providers that just really are not going to want to play in the same sandbox together. I'm sure that happens throughout the country.
Yep.
So whether a small town or 50,000 in Idaho Falls, any particular strategies or techniques to find some common ground, so to speak, from a collaborative standpoint?
Go first? Okay. So I'll speak to Montana first. We've had a really tough time getting the gospel missions, the shelters, to be interested in coordinated entry because they're not required. There is no public funding there, right? And so it is totally their choice, and they're saying, this sounds crazy and complicated and we're not interested. Some of them have said, come back in a few months and tell us how it's going, and some of them have told us where to go. And what we have seen, especially with shelters, it's different with longer term housing providers, but with shelters who are sheltering people who are homeless, meaning literally homeless folks, they need the coordinated entry system in order
order to get folks from shelter into permanent housing that is subsidized and where services are available. And they see that pretty quickly. They will see movement stop once coordinated entry fully launches, and they will realize we actually don't have a choice to come to the table in some kind of way so that the people we're serving can benefit and have access to our subsidized permanent housing resources. So that's one thing that we've seen. Some still remain resistant and try to open up their own permanent housing resources, which is fine as long as they're moving people into great permanent housing. That's fine, but over time, we tend to see people come on board, but it takes a couple of years, and them seeing negative things happen to the people that they're serving, which is really unfortunate. So, one thing we're doing in Montana with the more resistant emergency shelters is connecting them to the champions. We have 2 champions in Montana right now that are rescue missions that are willing to talk to others and say this is why we opted in from the beginning and what we've seen. So that's the biggest thing I can't talk anyone into it. I have failed so many times, but as soon as I connect the rescue missions with the common values and missions and all those things, that has been the thing that has changed some minds. There's usually an outlier. In most communities, there's typically at least one provider who's like, nope, not gonna do it.
So I've appreciated people's candidness, that's been from the get-go, so nobody's kind of playing games, so they've said here's where we are,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
we know what the deal is.
Yeah. One compromise that we've seen work, so do you have SSVF for veterans, rapid rehousing for veterans? Are you a provider? No? Okay, you have it. You know you have it, okay. So they tend to have more capacity than other providers to do outreach and complete assessments, and we've seen in Montana especially, our SSVF provider through the VOA has said, Volunteers America has said, we will actually, rescue mission who doesn't want to participate, can we send a staff member to the shelter once a week to complete assessments and get your folks on the by name list? And that partnership is sometimes enough for it to be enough to actually get folks housed. So if you can offer some sort of hybrid or taking something to them, that might be a good thing to offer at first.
So Southeastern Idaho has one. It's processed out of Logan,
Yeah.
Utah.
Like that's Homeless Veterans Fellowship.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's our SSVF provider.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a Region 6 provider there.
I think that program, so the HUD BASH doesn't go into Region 6, but I think SSVF does. I'm not 100% sure, but I think SSVF does.
We have some vouchers in Idaho Falls.
The
You must
SSVF
have
program?
something in the northern part of the state too. There's full. Yeah.
It's not a state, there's only 2 SSPF grantees in Idaho, and it's one that covers Ada, and then Vine, which does South Central Idaho.
Quarterly, that's.
St. Vincent de Paul, is that a?
Yeah,
That's-
we're not SSPF, we're,
Sure.
yeah, out of Coeur d'Alene, it's, out of Goodwood.
Okay, we've seen St. Vincent de Paul in Montana say we have a lot of very committed volunteers who show up every day who we could actually train to do some assessments and send into shelters. So if you have that opportunity to utilize volunteers, I know that's a tough one, but sometimes possible. And United Ways has stepped up in a massive way in Montana and actually funded partial positions to do a few